Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly want to thank my honourable colleague who just preceded me, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, for splitting his time with me. This is an alphabet soup, as people have mentioned, and sometimes hard. CPTPP and why is the UK suddenly joining it, and why are we discussing this today? But there are overlays and previous trade agreements, and perhaps something of a narrative might work quickly to review how we got to where we are today, and then I can highlight the concerns the Green Party has about these. Obviously, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement started quite a long time ago and was, again, as others have mentioned, the long list of countries that were initially involved, of course, all in the Pacific region. So Singapore but again, Malaysia, Japan, but then ones you don't necessarily expect, Peru, but yes, Peru's Pacific, as well as Canada, as well as New Zealand. And of course, one of the instigators of the original Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was the United States. Now, back in President Trump's first term in 2017, he pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, back to the UK and Canada's trade relationships with the UK. Well, this is obviously not the first or even the most important of Canada's trade agreements with the UK. And again, this goes back to trade agreements that countries enter into, and then somebody pulls out, and then the pieces have to sort of reassemble. So go back and look at Canada's first trade agreement with the UK was when the UK was part of the European Union, before the very tragic events that led to Brexit. And I do think that for the UK and indeed for the European Union, it was a dreadful and the skullduggery use of algorithms and social media, Cambridge Analytica and the sort. There's a tremendous documentary for people who want to see how vulnerable our democracies are to the misuse of social media and those kinds of campaigns, called An Uncivil War. I'm not going to give a whole film review, but it does star Benedict Cumberbatch. In case anyone wants to go look it up on Netflix, you can find it and watch it. And if, as a parliamentarian and someone who's run for elected office, it doesn't really leave you feeling quite shaken about how vulnerable we are to misinformation and how the British public was misled into pulling out of a very good, not just a trade agreement, but a governance agreement within the European Union that did a lot of benefit for the UK, and it was of benefit to the European Union that the UK was in it. So Canada's first trade deal with the UK, back to this particular piece, was the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which was negotiated between Canada and the EU, and of course part of the EU at that time was the UK. So we had a lot of pre-existing negotiations, conversations, negotiations, and then we come to the TPP, which was negotiated without the UK, but with the US. Now, one of the differences between these two agreements, do they entirely overlap? Since we already have negotiated, we went back actually, once the UK left the European Union, we went back and Canada renegotiated the bits we needed so that Canada would continue to have a trade deal with the UK once the UK left the European Union. So that got done. We have an existing trade agreement with the UK through the, still called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, but between Canada and the UK, largely based on the previous agreement that was done with the European Union. And now we have the TPP and the CPTPP, now without the United States, but with the UK. Now, why do I go through all this other than to remind people if they've heard threads of this before? But there's differences between these agreements, and they mean one is less advantageous to Canada and Canada's environment than the other. And that's that although both the CPTPP, which we're debating today, and the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, the CETA, both include things called investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe, Bhagat Akhton, has been the most engaged on this subject as we continue to debate it. I certainly agree with him and have always supported any efforts Canada can make to get out of such lopsided agreements which inevitably, invariably, and always gives superior rights to foreign corporations investing in Canada or operating in Canada. Even if they don't invest, they can open up a post office box somewhere and be considered an investor. Private sector corporations are bestowed with rights under investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms and agreements, the very first of which, by the way, we're now out of, what was Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which ironically did not survive into the new negotiations when it became CUSMA. Very glad that Chapter 11 of NAFTA is no more, but it was a prototype. And here's what it does. It says that if what a government does to a foreign corporation can be considered tantamount to expropriation, then that foreign corporation can sue the country in which it's operating. So we've had S.D. Myers sue Canada. We had Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia sue Canada. Canada tends to lose on these challenges because not only does Canada lose, but in general, the larger economic power wins. So if a U.S. corporation, it's not always the corporation that wins, if a U.S. corporation sues a government and the U.S. corporation is a giant, the U.S. corporation will win. If a Canadian corporation sues the U.S., the Canadian corporation will lose. There's a pattern. The larger economic power tends to win. The arbitrators are drawn from a rank of they're operating $500 an hour, $1,000 an hour lawyer kinds of people, and the investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, as has been established through numerous global studies, tend to favor the larger economic power, which means that what happens, and it was a shocker when it first happened, that decisions and laws passed democratically by governments, whether at the provincial or federal level, could be overturned by secret tribunals run by for-profit secret lawyers who make a case and argue that something was done that cost the corporation money. They don't even have to allege that it was done with an animus that was discriminatory towards that country or nation or corporation, just that it cost them money. So changing the regulations to protect the environment or changing the regulations to protect workers, if it costs them money, the government of Canada is going to pay out and pay a company from the U.S., which has happened to Canada an unfortunate number of times. So as we negotiate and discuss today this agreement, the CPTPP, which includes investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, they are of an order that's slightly less fair and slightly less transparent than similar agreements that were negotiated with the European Union under the CETA. So between the two, they both have investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, but the one we're debating today, where we're adding the UK to it, which means that UK corporations will be able to sue Canada under the TPP, just as now we're allowing Peruvian or Canadian companies more likely to sue Peru if we're mining in their country and don't like the laws to which we're being subjected. Those agreements will have less transparency than if we're working under the CETA, because there were enough elements within the European Union refused to pass the CETA as long as these investor-state dispute resolution measures were included. Avec seulement 7 minutes pour me résumer.
We've only 5 minutes. All I can say is that it is too late to renegotiate and to eliminate ISDS.
A light on them and decide that from henceforth Canada should get out of agreements that allow foreign corporations to have more power to sue the Canadian government, a province, or a First Nation, or a municipality for that matter. These agreements are corrosive to democracy. It's time to shine a light on them and start carving them out of what's now become routine with trade deals, is to throw in investor-state dispute resolutions. They are noxious. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.